Porque que tu mamá que.
Porque sí, no, está difícil. Bueno, muy bien, saludos. Mi queridísimo Abraham Bausa, ¿a quién quieres mandar a saludar? Perdón, disculpe usted. Usted puede seguir a mi querida Gaby Barrio Nuevo. Aquí tiene el Twitter en pantalla. Mire, ahí está. Regia de corazón, para que sus fans, que dice que ya tiene su grupo de fans.
Yo no digo nada,
No, bueno,
yo
ellos
no he
dicen
dicho
la verdad.
nada.
Ya la rockstar está empezando a tener rating por sus looks.
La vamos a tener que buscar en ClickView para ver cómo está el...
Eso, analizar. Imagínate que diga así.
No, pues no.
No, bueno, ahí lo tiene usted.
Ahí, Ángel, para que busques Regia de Corazón.
Regia de corazón. ¿Cuándo le vas a mandar a tu fan de Ferris Live TV?
Es que no me acuerdo cómo se llama. ¿Por qué me agarras así?
No, yo no te agarro nada. Ya quisieras, fíjate.
No, fíjate que no.
Bueno, muy bien.
Y esperamos que se haya comprado el otro fan, el microcell, para que...
Exacto, a Pimponaz. Que se haya comprado
que se lo haya comprado para que
el
tenga
microcell
mejor.
para que
le compre unos tacos.
Ey.
Nada más que no sean de trompo, porque me hacen daño.
Bueno, sácaselos de tofu. Bueno, muy bien, mi querido Abraham Bausa, ¿a quién quieres mandar saludar hoy? A Venezuela, chico, que no.
Aparte de Venezuela, que bueno, está en lo último y está bien feo todo eso ya. Mi abuela que acaba de cumplir 90 años.
Uy, qué padre.
Qué barbaridad. Saludos a la abuelita de Abraham. Saludos. Y bueno,
saludos.
Pues usted me puede seguir en Juan Tech TV, aquí le dejo mi Twitter en pantalla. Síganos, coméntenos, bienvenidos a La Gente Vive Canal. Gracias por transmitir Tecnocasters, gracias por transmitir los breves de tecnología Tecnocasters, a Ferris Live TV, a iTunes, a las plataformas que nos siguen. Muchísimas gracias. Y a usted, que gracias a su audiencia y gracias a su preferencia, hace que es el mejor podcast de tecnología en español. Nos escuchamos y nos vemos la próxima semana.
Bye.
Bye.
Hasta luego.
Unplugged in, Perseverance hits its mark.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the signs of past life.
The six-wheeled rover lands on Mars with high expectations.
Perseverance is also carrying a small helicopter called Ingenuity underneath, and that will be the first time, if it works, that we'll have powered flight on another planet.
And America's place in space is being challenged with a global competition for travel and exploration.
Competition from our perspective is always good.
Unlocking some of the mysteries of the red planet, Unplugged in, exploring Mars and beyond. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. After speeding hundreds of millions of miles through space over 7 months, America's space agency, NASA, successfully landed a six-wheeled rover on the surface of Mars. One of the goals of the mission? To determine if life existed there. It's the first leg in a U.S.-European effort to bring surface samples from Mars to Earth in the next 10 years.
Last week, after 7 months hurtling through space, NASA's six-wheeled Perseverance rover landed on Mars. The U.S. Space Agency released this video showing the first high-quality images of the spacecraft landing on the red planet. Its navigation cameras captured this 360-degree view of the landing site. Scientists also equipped Perseverance with 2 microphones. One of them was activated for landing and failed, but NASA managed to capture this audio of Martian wind just after touchdown. Dave Gruhl is a team lead at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He says this latest finding can help sustain the rover and its mission on Mars.
The noise is an incredible thing that engineers can use to basically detect the health of moving systems. If we get a snapshot of a actuator today, and you can compare over time, do another snapshot, another audio file of that actuator in the future, compare the two and see if there's anything that can be learned in terms of the health of that device.
NASA aimed to park its rover at the Jezero crater that scientists believe was once filled with water, an essential prerequisite for life as we know it. Perseverance is the biggest vehicle NASA has to rove on Mars. On board is the helicopter Ingenuity. Together, they will survey the Martian surface and collect samples that could answer an age-old question: did life ever exist beyond Earth? But that's not all, according to NASA's Thomas Zurbuchen.
What's so exciting about this, it's not only the landing and the investigations, which is the search for extinct ancient life from a time where life arose on Earth. If everything goes exactly like we hope, late in the 20s, we're going to go pick up the samples this vehicle is collecting and bringing it back to Earth for the first round trip to the planet Mars.
Perseverance is scheduled to spend at least 1 Martian year or 2 Earth years exploring the landing site region of the ancient river delta in a lake that once filled the Jezero crater. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
It is an amazing feat of engineering to get the rover and a helicopter to Mars intact. And then there is more amazing engineering to get everything to work properly and send back those mystical sounds and pictures. One of the people making it all work is Matt Smith, a systems engineer on the Mars 2020 mission at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I asked him about his role in the mission.
During our cruise to Mars, the 7 months we went to Mars, I was one of the flight directors. So we had a team of about 8 people who were responsible for flying the spacecraft, kind of a combination of pilot and air traffic controller and sort of team coach. I say, imagine Ed Harris in Apollo 13, but less drama.
Do you actually control the speed and the direction, or is it pre-programmed by the Perseverance?
We actually do have to do what we call the trajectory correction maneuvers over the course of cruise to enable us to hit our target for entry, descent, and landing. So we did 3 trajectory correction maneuvers on this mission, and we also do other activities like we turn the vehicle to make sure that we can maintain communication. We also do a lot of checkouts of all the backup subsystems. There's no like AAA on Mars, so we bring backups of everything. We have to check all that out. And we also check out the instruments. So actually cruise is a pretty busy time. And then before launch, I was on the team that tested and designed the rover and got it ready.
Okay, took off in July, landed in February. You only did 3 corrections in that time?
Yeah, that's right. We had an opportunity to do up to 6 if we needed them, but we have a navigation team that's constantly tracking where we are, and they help us determine whether or not we need to do those maneuvers. So it turned out we only needed to do 3 of them this time around.
What did you expect? Is that like average, or 3 is what you sort of expected, or is that unusual?
The prior mission that we're based on, the Mars Curiosity, it did 4 trajectory correction maneuvers. So 3 is 1 better than we expected. We expected we'd probably do 4.
Perseverance, when it took off from July until the time it landed, was it being watched 24/7 by humans?
Yeah, so at the very beginning, we did have 24/7 what we call coverage. So there's a network of antennas called the Deep Space Network that's managed by NASA, and there's antennas in California, Spain, and Australia. And the idea is that as the Earth rotates, you always can see any spot in the solar system with these antennas. So at the beginning of the mission, the first couple weeks, we did have 24/7 coverage. And then in the middle of the mission, in the middle of cruise, we had around 8 hours a day where we could talk to the spacecraft. And then near the very end, for the last month of cruise, we had 24/7 coverage, so that if anything came up, we had an ability to talk to the spacecraft and get it ready for landing.
All right, so you've outlined very careful, controlled Perseverance and what you can do to correct and everything. But the last 11 minutes before it landed, you had no ability to control it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, at landing, Perseverance was, I think, over 126 million miles away from Earth. So the time it takes radio signals traveling at the speed of light to get from Perseverance to Earth is, as you say, 11 minutes. So we really didn't have any ability to, in real time, joystick that landing, and the spacecraft had to do it all entirely on its own.
So it must have been a tough 11 minutes. When you realized that you were at that point, that 11 minutes, you thought, okay, well, we can't do anything and we don't know what's happening.
Yeah, well, and the way it works is as we approach landing, we're getting data from the vehicle the whole time. So, we know that it's approaching Mars, and we can see from the data that it's entering the atmosphere. And so we actually can see it going through all the steps of landing. It's just that that information is 11 minutes old by the time it reaches us. So it's already happened by the time we receive the signal back that landing was good.
Okay, its first job, Perseverance, is to get some samples, get some rocks, get some cores. That's its first job?
Yeah, so it's going to do a few things. It's going to, as you say, collect samples, and this is kind of the first leg of a round trip from Mars back to Earth. Also, Perseverance has a couple other what we call technology demonstrations to kind of lead the way for other missions. So one of those is an experiment called MOXIE, which will actually generate oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. It's mostly carbon dioxide. And that's to pave the way for potential human exploration of Mars. Obviously, we need oxygen to breathe, and also it can be used for rocket fuel. And Perseverance is also carrying a small helicopter called Ingenuity underneath, and that will be the first time, if it works, that we'll have powered flight on another planet, which could maybe pave the way for larger flying vehicles in the future to do more exploration.
Well, one of the goals of the mission is to find out if life ever existed on Mars. Will you be able to tell that from the pictures it sends back, or do you have to wait for it collecting its samples and we send some other vehicle up to get those samples whenever that happens? Or can you tell that from the pictures that can be sent back or information you get?
My sense talking to the scientists is that we'll have a good indication from the payload and the pictures and the spectra that we get there. But there's this saying that exceptional claims require exceptional proof, and really to get absolutely definitive proof of ancient microbial life, say for example an image of a microbe or something, we likely would have to return the samples to Earth and use really large and sophisticated equipment that we could never fit on a rover to do that final confirmation. So I think really because finding life on Mars would be such an incredible thing and such an important discovery, you really want to be super sure, and that would require bringing the samples back to Earth and analyzing them here.
All right, the rovers we've already sent up at Perseverance, they stay. So something's got to go and get the samples that have been collected. We've never done that before, sent something to pick up samples and come back. When is that likely to happen? How far are we from developing the technology, or do we already have it? That seems like a more difficult task to me, just to land something, collect something, and also be able to leave.
Yeah, you're totally right. It is a huge challenge. Good news is the technology demonstrations the technology development is already in work at NASA and our partners at the European Space Agency. And the idea is that we would send a mission in the kind of latter half of the 2020s that would land another rover on Mars and a small rocket. That rover would go then and fetch the samples, bring them to the rocket that's on the surface of Mars, blast them into Mars orbit, and then we would have a third spacecraft that would go grab those samples from Mars orbit and bring them back to Earth. So a lot of moving pieces, but we're already starting on those.
But that's going to be 8 or 9 years from now, right? That we collect them?
That's right, yep.
Now let me turn to Ingenuity, the helicopter that's been sent up. And what is first the difficulty or the uncertainty about whether or not it'll fly? That's the first thing. And secondly, why did you want to send a helicopter? If we've got the rover, it can take pictures, it can gather things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that makes flying a helicopter on Mars so difficult is that the atmosphere of Mars is extremely thin compared to Earth. So it's only about 1% of the density of Earth. And we've tested the helicopter on Earth in a vacuum chamber that has been pumped down to simulate the environment of Mars, and it worked pretty well. But there's a lot of unknowns, like how will wind affect the helicopter. To make it fly on Mars, the rotors have to spin extremely fast. It also has to be very light. So this is a really big challenge to fly on Mars. And one of the reasons we're doing this is I sort of think of it as analogous to a mission NASA sent in 1997. They landed a mission called Pathfinder, and there was a small rover called Sojourner on it. It was about the size of a microwave. And it was the first rover on another planet. And now we have a big SUV-sized rover that's roving Mars. So if we think about the helicopters maybe analogous to that, hopefully in the future we could have much larger helicopters exploring. And that would let us cover a lot more area a lot more quickly. The rover itself only travels at like a little less than walking speed, if you can believe it. So we can get a lot of places, but it's relatively slow, and a flying vehicle would let us explore so much more quickly.
Do you expect to find some evidence of life on Mars? I mean, what's your sort of expert opinion and hypothesis?
So my own personal opinion is that the scientists tell me that we know that this location that we're sitting, Jezero Crater, was an ancient lake bed. We know that there was water there, and this was billions of years ago, around the same time that microbial life was getting a foothold on Earth. So we really are in the best position possible, almost on the entire planet, to find ancient microbial life if it existed.
How do you know there was water there? I mean, it looks like to me, and I see the pictures, it looks like a desert to me, but I mean, how do you know there was water there?
That's actually a big question from the scientific community. We knew Mars was a lot warmer and wetter. Mars doesn't have the same magnetic field that Earth does. So there's some hypotheses about interaction with solar wind. But I think that is still one of the big questions is, what happened to the Martian, the water on Mars? Perhaps it's frozen under the surface. Perhaps it got lost into space over billions of years. That's something that planetary scientists are still trying to unwrap.
Is NASA preparing for human exploration? We've sent these rovers, but what about humans?
Yeah, Mars is definitely on the roadmap for NASA's human exploration program. So the Artemis project is NASA's current effort to return the next man and the first woman to the moon. And eventually that would lay the groundwork for sending humans to Mars, later in this century. And it's definitely the long-term goal of NASA human exploration to put humans on Mars.
What are you most excited to learn about with this, with Perseverance, with its mission?
Well, I think some of the questions we've talked about, like, was Mars habitable? Is there evidence of ancient microbial life? I mean, to me, that's incredible science. That's the type of thing that, rewrites our textbooks and would really change our understanding of where we fit in the universe and maybe where life could exist elsewhere on other planets or around other stars. So to me, that's really exciting. I'm also just, as an engineer, super excited to see the Ingenuity helicopter take off. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So a lot of really cool things going on with this mission.
What's your wish list? What would you like to do beyond this in terms of space exploration?
Well, one of my sort of pet interests is a field called exoplanets. So exoplanets are planets that orbit stars other than our sun. And 25 or 30 years ago, this was we didn't know of any exoplanets. It was sort of a pie in the sky dream. But a few missions recently have shown us that essentially almost every star in the universe has at least one planet around us. And we're just developing the technologies now to be able to detect those planets, image them. It's a really hard problem because it's like looking for a firefly next to a lighthouse in terms of the brightness of the planet and the brightness of the star. But I mean, imagine if you found a sun-like star and were able to detect an Earth-like planet around it. That could really, increase our chances of finding a habitable location besides our Earth elsewhere in the galaxy.
Well, it's so exciting, and I appreciate you talking to me today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
SpaceX, the company founded by Elon Musk, is planning to launch the first space flight with an all-civilian crew. The spacecraft will orbit the Earth for several days, sometime in the fall. It will be a 4-person crew led by an American billionaire and pilot, Jared Isaacman, who is paying SpaceX an undisclosed sum of money for the flight. Also selected for the flight, a young woman who beat the odds against bone cancer. When it lifts off, she will become the youngest American in space. Plugged In's Elizabeth Chernoff has her story.
So I'm going to space.
Haley Arsenault is 29, a cancer survivor, and now she could become the youngest American person ever to fly into space.
As one for all. Getting this call to go to space came out of completely nowhere. And but I think that's the beauty of life, is sometimes it surprises you.
The opportunity has come her way through her workplace, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. It was where she was treated as a child battling bone cancer.
So when I was 10 years old, I was working my way towards my black belt. And I had actually just gotten my black belt in Taekwondo before I was diagnosed with cancer. But I started having knee pain. And they thought it was from overuse from the Taekwondo. But then I started limping. And my mom noticed a big knot above my left knee. And she took me to the doctor, who did an x-ray. And I'll never forget, she came in the room with me and my parents and just said, "This is bone cancer."
My disease is called osteosarcoma, and it's a bone cancer. It's very serious. If you don't catch it fast, it spreads
I spent a year at St. Jude undergoing intense chemo and then also surgery to save my leg. And as difficult as that year was physically, it was the most meaningful year of my life.
Arsenault now works at St. Jude as a physician assistant. She was chosen by the hospital and billionaire philanthropist Jared Isaacman to fly on the private Inspiration 4 SpaceX mission later in 2021.
3, 2, 1, 0.
It will be the first space flight without an astronaut aboard, but before liftoff, there's training to be done.
It'll start with the centrifuge training, like going around really fast to feel all the G-forces. And then we're just going to prepare for any possible situation. We're going to spend a lot of time in the Dragon simulator. And then I'll get some additional preparation as I'm the medical officer of this flight.
Unlike the NASA and SpaceX flights that go to the International Space Station, this one will travel around Earth for several days, during which time Arsenault said she expects to participate in science experiments and also make time to video call kids at the hospital.
I really hope to inspire these kids by going on this mission to dream big, that they can do anything. I was talking to this little girl yesterday and she was saying that she's upset that she can't run or jump. And I said, I can't run or jump either because I have a prosthesis in my leg. But I said, that's not stopping me from going to space. And so, this mission is opening space travel up to anyone. And I think that in itself is going to motivate people and give them so much hope. Kids are so visual, and I hope that them being able to see me in space really shows them what their future can look like. I'm the first St. Jude patient to go to space, the first pediatric cancer survivor, but I know I'm not going to be the last.
The United States is not alone with a mission to the Red Planet. United Arab Emirates and China have missions to Mars. The UAE says space has opened a broad range of possibilities for everyone in the Arab world.
The Martian surface has never been so popular for Earthling vessels. In July 2020, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and China launched missions to the Red Planet. At the time, Earth and Mars had the type of ideal alignment that only happens every 26 months. Sarah Al-Amiri is chair of the UAE Space Agency. She says the years-long journey to build and launch a craft could inspire other Arab nations.
Today you have households of every single age group passionate about space, understanding a lot of science that happens in there. It's opened a broad realm for possibilities for everyone within the UAE and also, and I truly hope, within the Arab world.
The UAE's orbiter fired its main engines for 27 minutes to enter the Martian atmosphere in what's being called the Hope maneuver. It took another 17 minutes for nervous scientists on Earth to learn the good news. The following footage comes from Chinese state television, and VOA cannot independently verify its content. It claims to show scientists at the moment China's Tianwen-1 probe entered orbit around Mars. The Chinese craft executed a similar slowdown technique to the UAE's Hope maneuver. Tianwen-1 will stay in a so-called parking orbit to survey the surface, looking for potential landing sites in May or June. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
The competition for natural resources is making space the next frontier to mine for minerals needed for the next generation of batteries, electronics, and military equipment. Jim Green is chief scientist at NASA. Among his achievements is leading the 2012 mission landing the rover Curiosity on Mars. I asked him about the benefits of space exploration programs.
Well, what's happening in many ways is humans are leaving low Earth orbit. Our plans are then to trek to the moon, learn to live and work on a planetary surface, and then investigate Mars into the future. Mars is a pretty spectacular place. I mean, it is a planet that we can actually live and work on like none other. So we're interested from a scientific point of view. Its history. How did it come together? What is it made of? Are there resources there? Can and how would we live there? And it tells us a lot about the potential for maybe a place where life could have started, when life started here on Earth. we've got to learn to live and work on a planetary surface. We want to be able to tease out the resources that are on the moon. We believe there's actually a significant amount of water in frozen form, trapped in permanently shadowed craters in the south and north pole of the moon, which is why we're going to the South Pole. Once we learn how to extract that and begin to use that, because we can breathe the oxygen that comes from water, we can, of course, drink the water. We also can create rocket fuel. That's actually some of the first things that we want to do when we go to Mars.
And have any of the discoveries been of benefit here on Earth? Any of the discoveries from the space station or any of our exploration?
Oh, there's been an enormous number of discoveries that have occurred on space station that we're using here on Earth. We're learning that in space without gravity, certain types of things like crystals can grow. We also learn that changes in the body that are not related to the gravity then can be really looked at more carefully. And therefore, we've seen a variety of medical advances that have occurred from space station astronauts.
All right, we had a space race with the Soviet Union, which led to the man on the moon. We got there first. Are we in a space race, for instance, now with China? I mean, is there competition? And good competition. I don't necessarily mean, a bad competition.
Right. Yeah. Competition from our perspective is always good. We're excited to see what the Chinese are doing. They have plans also to land on the moon. They have several rovers there now. We're turning our attention to do that. They've started to build a space station. That's exciting. So they're discovering some of the major scientific activities that we have been working in for several decades. So this kind of work is very healthy between these nations.
And what are other nations doing?
Some nations are getting into this concept of getting more commercial companies going. I know the Japanese are, and a couple are starting up in Europe too. So it's a model, I think, that's going to leave the U.S. and go into many of these other countries to be followed.
And is NASA now working with private companies? Is that something a little bit different?
It is different, and it's really a very important part of the whole plan. And the concept is, of course, getting more companies having the ability to get into space, because we have the space station. SpaceX and Blue Origin and a number of others can allow transportation back and forth that enables us to turn our attention to these grander plans about going to the moon.
Are the private companies and NASA working well together, or is there some stepping on feet and duplication of what the private enterprise is doing and what NASA is doing?
What you're looking at on your screen.
Well, the private companies together form a competitive network, as we always like to have. We always are looking for the best price for the best product. So that's going on. But from our perspective, it's a really healthy environment because we have a number of companies and groups to work with.
What are you most interested in seeing in this, in Perseverance? I mean, what's the one sort of thing you want to see if it can do?
Well, what it will be doing that we really want is it will be coring rock. And in fact, here's an example of one of the cores. It looks like a piece of chalkboard chalk or Crayola creme, depending on what era you're born in. We don't use chalkboards anymore these days. But we want to core rock in certain places where there's sediments in these deltas, where life may have really come down these rivers and then deposited and created the rock that we see today. And then we want to bring those sediments back. Just like the Apollo rocks, we want to be able to interrogate these in our laboratory and really tease out the history of Mars through the rock record.
Well, Perseverance got a core and gather those rocks. Does it deposit it someplace, and how do we get those rocks back to Earth?
The plan is that we will go to a location and create several cores. We put those cores in a metal sleeve, all right? And then that is sealed, and then we lay that on the surface and then move on to other areas. So we will be leaving these samples on the surface for later pickup.
And what's later pickup?
Well, We're planning those missions right now. That's the next thing.
Are we all alone in this universe?
So my answer to that is, this is why we're going to Mars and why we're looking out beyond our solar system for planets that are more Earth-like to determine if we are alone or not.
All right, so we have the moon, we have Mars. Looking beyond that, what do you see NASA doing?
Well, Moon and Mars is going to be enough for, in terms of human exploration, for sure, for the next several hundred years. But, you know, NASA's doing a lot in many other ways. We have missions that are currently at Jupiter. We have one that's way out in the outer part of the solar system. The Voyagers are still working, and we've gone into the Kuiper Belt with New Horizons. So we have quite a spectacular program all over the solar system.
Jim, thank you for talking to me, and thank you for your work. I got to tell you, I'm a big fan of NASA. It's very inspirational. It's very exciting, and I would have loved to have been part of the space program in some way. I chose the wrong career.
Well, there's always room for you, Greta. Come on. You can come help us anytime you'd like. Thank you so much for inviting me.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guests, NASA Chief Scientist Jim Green, Matt Smith, Systems Engineer for the Mars rover Perseverance. Keep up with the latest news at voanews.com, and do follow me on Twitter @Greta. And we leave you with more of the amazing images from Mars. Thank you for being plugged in.
COVID-19 transformed the way we do business. Now more than ever, fast lead generation and customer retention will determine if a business survives or not. The Now Media Video Business Card is designed to be sent using your smartphone. It's the next generation business card that will open the door for you while keeping social distancing. The Now Media Video Business Card is affordable for anyone from startups to multinational companies and is already being used by hundreds of businesses. Stay open, stay in business. Call us today.
On Plugged In, it's been 1 year of life and death in the COVID pandemic, but an end is in sight.
We're now on track to have enough vaccine supply for every adult in America by the end of May.
With more shots going into more arms, what will happen with the virus?
6 months to a year from now, once almost everyone has had either a vaccination or a first infection, I think that we could likely get back to something resembling normal life, whatever that is.
The lessons learned from all over the world and a peek into how we live with COVID on Plugged In, the pandemic year. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. 1 year ago, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic for the novel coronavirus COVID-19. Since then, more than 150 million cases have been recorded, and more than 2.5 million people have died. The United States has had more reported infections than the top 3 countries combined, and the U.S. has had more than 500,000 people who have died from the virus. Since taking office, President Joe Biden has prioritized ending the pandemic, promising that by the end of May, a vaccination shot for every American who wants one. VOA Steve Baragona has covered the pandemic since the beginning. Today, he is looking ahead to how this might end.
After a year of empty streets and full hospitals in much of the U.S., the beginning of the end is in sight.
But I think by the fall, unless there's something very bad with variants that comes along, we're going to see sporting events in person, we're going to see social events, movies, theater, restaurants and bars.
Vaccinations are speeding up, A third vaccine is online from Johnson & Johnson, and a rival company, Merck, will help increase supplies in a deal brokered by President Joe Biden's administration.
We're now on track to have enough vaccine supply for every adult in America by the end of May.
We'll have an oversupply, and I suspect that by the summer, we'll start to be donating our doses to low and middle income countries.
Gustin says it's in the interest of wealthy countries to make sure lower income countries get vaccinated. Dangerous variants can appear anywhere the virus is spreading. They could slow the return to normal. Some are already weakening the vaccines. The shots still look effective, but new variants will keep evolving.
They're essentially a shot across the bow, telling us that this virus is sneaky and it has the ability to evade our defenses.
Another thing that could slow the return to normal? Relaxing control measures too soon, says University of Washington epidemiologist Ali Muqdad.
We made the same mistake last year, remember? And we have to be very careful right now. We should not repeat the same mistake, especially at a time where we know there are more variants coming up.
And yet, several states are doing just that. Texas Governor Greg Abbott.
All businesses of any type are allowed to open 100%. Also, I am ending the statewide mask mandate.
Biden called the move Neanderthal thinking.
I think it's a big mistake. Look, I hope everybody's realized by now, these masks make a difference.
In the long term, the biggest problem may be people who do not trust the vaccines. Surveys say that's about a quarter of Americans, a third of people in 6 African countries, and 79% in Lebanon, to name a few.
There is deep hesitancy. I think people will get less hesitant as they see this working and they see their neighbors and family members getting vaccinated. But there will be a small group of people who don't want the vaccine.
That sets the stage for flare-ups down the road. Ultimately, COVID-19 may be here to stay, so an annual COVID shot may be too. Experts say that means many more countries need vaccine manufacturing plants, so the world is not stuck again with shots for rich countries while everyone else is left behind. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
In Britain, students are now going back to school as part of the UK's plan to lift all COVID restrictions by June. In Italy, people over the age of 65 are now approved for the AstraZeneca vaccine. European countries had hoped their well-funded healthcare systems would offer some protection, but the continent was one of COVID's early targets, and it still faces high infection rates. From London, here is VOA's Henry Ridgewell on Europe's pandemic year.
Codogno in northern Italy still bears the scars of its unwanted fame, the epicenter of Europe's first coronavirus outbreak. On February 20th last year, a 38-year-old was admitted to the hospital with breathing problems. He was diagnosed with the virus the following day. Head doctor Francesco Tursi recalls the horror that unfolded.
Ne arrivano 2, ne arrivano 3.
We heard about 1, 2, 3 cases, and we were immediately submerged with patients with serious breathing problems. They couldn't breathe. We didn't even have time to think. This literally changed our lives.
Tursi himself caught the virus days later and spent a month in the hospital. As cases multiplied, northern Italy went into lockdown. It was too little, too late. In the following days, several European countries reported new cases. By the time the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on March 11th, Spain, France, and several other European states had imposed lockdowns. But Britain held off, delaying its lockdown for 2 more weeks against scientific advice.
Had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half.
Britain would suffer the highest coronavirus death toll in Europe in 2020. Its economy was also among the worst hit, shrinking by 10%.
The UK is really a great example of this notion that when you try to choose between public health or the economy, you lose both.
In Turkey, doctors accused the government of trying to hide the true scale of the pandemic as hospitals filled with patients. Russia was also accused of a cover-up, with doctors claiming the true death toll was likely 3 times higher than the official total of 57,000 deaths in 2020. As lockdowns continued into the summer, governments across Europe pumped billions into their economies to try to keep businesses afloat and people in jobs. Public debt soared. But as a bleak 2020 drew to a close, science offered hope. Medical trials showed that several vaccines offered remarkable protection against COVID-19, with Britain the first Western country to roll out a mass vaccination programme.
We cannot underestimate the scale of achievement that this has been, to go from the identification of a new virus and sequence it only in January of 2020 to 11 months later having a number of safe and extraordinarily effective vaccines.
Dangers lurk ahead. Infections remain high, and there are fears over new, more resistant strains of the virus circulating in Europe. Back in Codogno, Dr. Terzi is still treating coronavirus patients. Like hundreds of thousands of other frontline workers, Terzi risked his life to help others survive. The pandemic has changed life in countless ways, and it's not over yet. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
The U.S. is pledging $4 billion to help distribute COVID-19 vaccines to developing nations. A new variant of the virus has led to high infection and death rates in South Africa and neighboring countries. From Johannesburg, VOA's Anita Powell reports on Africa's challenges of the pandemic year.
What a difference a year makes in the life of a pandemic. But in Africa, what a difference a week makes. In recent weeks, as Africa prepared to mark the milestone of a year since the virus made landfall, millions of long-awaited vaccine doses finally began to rain upon the continent. Many were provided by the global COVAX facility, which provides vaccines to lower-income countries. That, officials say, has flipped this tale from one of despair to one of hope. And, says South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, Africa had a hand in turning the tide.
South Africa's scientists and research institutions have made an important contribution to these efforts and have contributed to global knowledge about the disease, including on the emergence of new variants. And in this regard, our scientists, who we should be proud of, have really led the way, and they are recognized globally.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa, officials this month received their first delivery of 1.7 million vaccines through COVAX. Village Reach, an aid organization that focuses on remote, rural, low-income countries, has been working to help that population. Their DRC country director told VOA that while African nations appear to have a lower proportion of confirmed cases and deaths, the pandemic has still hit hard here.
Africa, yes, we are also affected as the rest of the world in different proportion, but we have to continue to protect ourselves through all the protective measures, but also we have to get vaccinated so that we are all protected.
Dr. Richard Lessels, one of South Africa's top viral researchers, says the continent's largest vaccine drive, in South Africa, looks promising after fits and starts. Last month, South African authorities suddenly reversed course after receiving 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which researchers found to be less effective against the new variant that accounts for the majority of the nation's new cases. South Africa quickly switched to the Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, but the process still delayed the vaccination campaign. Lessels says that as the continent stares down this anniversary, it means one thing: time.
I think only time will tell once we get beyond that first priority group of the healthcare workers and start delivering it to the other vulnerable groups within the population. We'll then get a much better sense of how we're doing here in South Africa.
So what is year 2 of the pandemic going to look like in Africa? On this, everyone seems to agree. Busy. Anita Powell, VOA News, Johannesburg.
As vaccinations ramp up, experts studying COVID-19 are taking what they have learned about the virus to model its behavior in the weeks and months, even years ahead. Jenny Levine is an infectious disease researcher at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I asked her about what living with COVID might look like.
Of course, there's a lot of unknowns because this is a new beast in the human population, but we do live with some of its very close relatives, which are endemic coronaviruses. And so we've been looking to them to try to understand what this might look like, what COVID-19 might look like when it becomes endemic. So when it's no longer in this phase where we're having a giant outbreak, where everyone, tons and tons of people are getting infected in a very short span of time. And so we've been looking at these 4 human coronaviruses that circulate endemically. And interestingly, they just cause a mild cold in the vast majority of people. And so we've been trying to understand, how does that relate to what is happening with this, the massive hospitalizations and deaths with COVID-19? And is it possible that that's what COVID-19 will look like in the future?
Well, we've got a number of vaccines, and we seem to be marching forward to trying to get this behind it. We've got a huge road ahead of us, and everyone has some level, or not everyone, but a lot of people have some level of optimism. Is there something that you're a little bit concerned about? Is there something sort of on your radar screen that worries you?
Yeah, there is. I think what we're seeing right now, we're sort of starting to see the first evidence of what happens in populations where a lot of people have immunity. And so I think all of these sort of predictions that we've been talking about in the past few minutes, many of which are fairly optimistic, that maybe this could just turn into another common cold, which would be fantastic and does seem plausible. It really relies on the idea that 1 or 2 infections or 1 or 2 doses of vaccine will lead to really long-lasting disease-reducing immunity. It doesn't have to have such strong immunity that it blocks transmission, but it does really have to reduce disease for a long time.
Is there any explanation as to why, if you even know, is that why children, at least right now, seem less likely to get COVID? Is there any explanation for that?
We don't know. It seems like they may be somewhat less likely to get it. And it's very clear that if they get it, they're way less likely to get a severe case, which is really promising in the long term. But we don't know why. We really just don't know. It's one of those mysteries. There's a group in New York City who looks at age effects on the immune system and how different aged people respond to these viruses, and they're doing some work to try to figure it out, but we don't know.
It's so easy to look at things with 2020, and the world looks at SARS-CoV-2, and we now see the devastating effect of it. Should we have seen it coming so that we could have headed it off more at the pass instead of basically making it easier to spread around the world? And is there a SARS-CoV-3 on the horizon? Or do you fear one?
Yeah. I think we're learning a lot of lessons about, pandemic preparedness right now. I think that there are characteristics of SARS-CoV-2, of COVID-19, that are different and made it harder for the world to contain it than SARS-CoV-1. And a lot of that has to do with what we were talking about before of how transmissible it is. That said, there are countries that have done a really, really good job of containing it. And in containing it, they not only prevented infections and hospitalizations and deaths in their country, they gave the virus a little bit less room to develop these variants before we could get vaccines out. So I think it's a hard bug, and it would have been hard under any circumstances. I also think that I hope that the world, as a global community, we've learned some lessons about the importance of early containment.
Do you want to go out on a limb and sort of guess when we can predict when we can get back to normal, or is that an impossibility?
I think if a dose or 2 of vaccine or an infection or 2 prevents severe disease, even if it allows for transmission like we were just talking about, If it prevents severe disease for a long time, then 6 months to a year from now, once almost everyone has had either a vaccination or a first infection, I think that we could likely get back to something resembling normal life, whatever that is.
Whatever that means. Well, that sounds like a little light at the end of the tunnel, and thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Several weeks before the pandemic was declared on March 11, 2020, COVID-19 spread from China to the Middle East. It was deadliest in Iran, and the virus's spread only made the region's existing crises worse. VOA's Henry Ridgwell has the story of the pandemic year in the Middle East.
Iran recorded its first coronavirus infections in February 2020, one of the first outbreaks outside China. Within days, it had become a global epicenter. Government figures suggest 60,000 people have died since the outbreak began, but the true number is likely far higher. Critics say early mistakes by the government cost lives.
You saw them first deny it, then downplay it. The challenge is that the health and welfare of its own people is not priority number one. And when you're facing a global pandemic, that means your citizens are going to bear the brunt of it.
By the time the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic on March 11th, the outbreak had spread across the Middle East. In Yemen and Syria, countries racked by deep-rooted conflicts, the pandemic compounded the pressure on fragile health systems. In May, the United Nations warned that the Yemeni health system had collapsed.
When there was a spike in deaths because of the coronavirus and other diseases, the workers were not able to keep up with the digging, the burial and finishing of the graves.
The festival of Eid al-Fitr in May, the end of Ramadan, was marked with somber, socially distanced worship across the Muslim world. In Lebanon, economic and political crises compounded by the pandemic and exacerbated by the August explosion in Beirut port pushed the country to the brink. By September, there were worsening outbreaks in several refugee camps in Yemen, Syria, Iraq and Lebanon. As third waves of the pandemic gripped Europe, the United States and Latin America at the end of 2020, the Middle East fared better than many feared. But the World Health Organization warns the situation remains precarious.
In our region, where people and healthcare institutions suffer constantly with war, natural disasters and disease, this virus has demanded all our efforts.
That effort is now being directed towards vaccinations. Israel has rolled out the fastest mass vaccination program in the world. Over half the population has received a first dose.
Number one, they did some things right in terms of purchasing agreements and getting early access to the vaccines. But really, this is all about operations and organization.
Vaccination rates vary sharply across the Middle East. In the occupied West Bank and Gaza, vaccination rates lag far behind those in Israel. The United Nations says Israel should provide vaccines. The Israeli government says healthcare is the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. Many countries in the region are using Chinese and Russian-made vaccines and are hoping to benefit from the global COVAX facility, which provides vaccines to poorer nations. The danger is not over. The World Health Organization says new strains of the virus are circulating in the region, which could be more infectious and resistant to vaccines. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News.
Scientists and doctors have been describing COVID-19 as a novel coronavirus. Novel meaning that it's new and attacking people in ways never seen before from a coronavirus. VOA health correspondent Carol Pearson explains what medical experts have discovered and are still mystified about in the pandemic year.
COVID-19 is a respiratory disease caused by a virus, officially known as SARS-CoV-2, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. It's the second time a coronavirus has sickened people and caused death. SARS first appeared in China in November 2002. The current version of the virus emerged from China in 2019, which is why it's called COVID-19. The virus invades the lungs. It multiplies and neutralizes the molecules that help us fight infection. Most people recover, but the virus can damage the lungs and leave patients gasping for air. Thomas Steele needed a double lung transplant because of COVID.
It's nothing like sitting in your hospital room gasping for every breath of air you take, and I did that for 58 days.
The lungs pass oxygen into the bloodstream, and the virus can damage the lungs and make the oxygen levels fall. Patients may need to be put on a ventilator to help them breathe. COVID-19 can also cause dangerous clotting in the bloodstream. People who already have damaged blood vessels from high blood pressure or stroke, and those with heart disease have a higher risk of serious disease. These clots can form throughout the body, including in the lungs and the heart. The clotting can cause heart attack.
Bienvenidos al programa número 18 de Ruta 2021. Yo soy Alejandro Cacho. Comenzamos.
Faltan 91 días para las elecciones de este 2021.
Hoy tenemos encuestas nuevas, las más recientes, en los 15 estados que elegirán gobernador. La Ruta 2021 entra en una fase decisiva. El viernes arrancaron las campañas para gobernador en Guerrero, Nuevo León, San Luis Potosí, Colima y Sonora. De esos 5 estados, en 4 lleva la delantera Morena, según las encuestas. Los candidatos tendrán ahora hasta el 2 de junio para convencer a los electores. Con tal de ganar, harán de todo. Habrá lemas de campaña.
Vamos a la segura con Octavio Pedrosa.
Contigo, vamos a la segura. Agradezco la confianza que me han brindado los partidos integrantes de la coalición. Juntos haremos historia en Sonora.
El eslogan, déjame escucharte.
Soy Indira y vienen nuevos tiempos para nuestra colina.
También, como siempre, promesas.
Les voy a presentar mi 7 de 7. Sí, mi 7 de 7. Porque lo 3 de 3 ya pasó. Y lo más importante, la declaración de no violencia contra la mujer.
Voy a liberar a San Luis Potosí de la pandemia de la inseguridad para que trabajemos sin miedo, descansemos sin miedo, caminemos sin miedo.
No permitiremos que las decisiones de nuestro estado se tomen en la Ciudad de México.
Y a nuestro pueblo de Sonora les digo que no les vamos a fallar.
Que el peso que se invierte en infraestructura, en transporte, en salud, en medicinas, se va a traducir en bienestar para los neoloneses.
A pesar de la pandemia, créame, habrá eventos públicos.
Todo mi entusiasmo de trabajar junto con las mujeres, con las personas, con la igualdad.
En este monumento, símbolo de la paz, iniciamos la construcción de un nuevo futuro para Nuevo León.
Yo quiero ser gobernador y yo puedo ser gobernadora porque sé que estaré acompañada de todas y de todos ustedes desde ahorita. Agradezco a mis compañeras y compañeras diputados federales, diputados locales. Agradezco a hombres y mujeres que han luchado para combatir la desigualdad.
Y claro, no puede faltar la guerra sucia.
En los últimos años, Nuevo León ha perdido el rumbo y el liderazgo. Ya no hay tiempo que perder. Yo sí voy a trabajar por ti.
Desde luego aquí en Heraldo Media Group tendremos todos los detalles de la contienda y haremos un seguimiento puntual de los candidatos. Porque queremos que usted vote, que sea parte del ejercicio democrático más grande en la historia de México. Que vote por quien mejor le parezca, pero que vote informado y con plena conciencia. Como ha sucedido desde noviembre, por supuesto que habrá encuestas, las que nos brinda Opinión Pública, Marketing e Imagen y Social Research Solutions. Por eso, ¿qué le parece si comenzamos revisando el escenario en Guerrero? Blanca Becerril.
Hola Alejandro, pues contrario a lo que marca el calendario electoral, el partido Morena no inició el viernes campaña electoral a la gubernatura de Guerrero. Dijo que esperaría el dictamen final de su Comisión Nacional de Elecciones a emitirse en los próximos días. Aunque de manera oficial, los órganos internos de Morena siguen levantando encuestas que les permitan pues valorar los perfiles de los